Nintendo's moat is obviously built upon its IP of Mario and Zelda and Donkey Kong. We're not really breaking any new ground by saying that, but I think what you wouldn't understand just jumping into it is how strong of a moat that is and how clearly it shows up in some of the numbers, and how that moat, even though it's being attacked from multiple angles, including Microsoft's acquisition of Activision and Blizzard, just cannot be disrupted. So that's exactly what we're going to get into today. We're going to look at the intangible assets, their IP. We're going to look at the cost advantages that Nintendo has versus the competition. We're going to look at network effects and switching costs, which are Nintendo's weak spot and where they might struggle in the future against PlayStation or Xbox or PC. And then we're finally going to look at pricing power, because that is where the strong elements of their moat all come together and result in this business that basically doesn't ever have to discount its products and just is a total cash cow. Before we get into it, my name's Christian. I'm a CPA and senior financial analyst, and I love talking about this type of stuff. So if you like talking about this stuff, then you should subscribe, because I do it a lot. So like I said, the first element of the moat that we're going to look at is the intangible assets, because that is not only the oldest and strongest part of Nintendo's moat, but it's also where a lot of the other strengths of Nintendo come from. If you're looking at sort of cost advantages and pricing power, it's all predicated on the IP. You can't understand any of it without understanding the strength of the IP. So the first thing to really understand is that almost all of the IP, Mario, Zelda, Donkey Kong, Animal Crossing, Kirby, Star Fox, etc., they're all created in-house, and a lot of it is actually created by one person, which we'll get to. And it has been not only created, but also curated over decades by the same studios and the same teams. And the reason why that's important is because there's no leakage of the royalty revenues that they receive. It all goes back to them. There's no license to lose and no studio partner to renegotiate with. So an example of this is I was in Tokyo recently, and they have all these department stores, and sort of each level in the department store has a different theme, and sometimes those are like gaming and manga and stuff like that. So you can go to like the Pokemon store or the Nintendo store, and then on the same floor there might be a store for Capcom or something like that. And one of the people that I was with on my trip loves One Piece, and so he was going into the store that has One Piece, and I was researching Nintendo while we were there, and it made me think like, okay, well, I'm already halfway through this research. I know Nintendo's like a great business. Let me check out One Piece. And what I very quickly found out is there's like the owners of One Piece and like the creators of One Piece and the distributors of One Piece, and it's this really messy mosaic of who gets the revenue from that manga series and all the sort of like spin-off businesses from it. And it sort of clicked for me in that moment why Nintendo is so special, because they own the IP, they have full control over the creative pipeline, including the timing of when it's released. So there's a lot less risk of someone else burning out your audience on your content, because you get to choose. Like they might release a new Mario game every 5 to 6 years, and there's so much value in that, in having a full vertical system of content creation around that IP that very few other businesses really have that are in this industry. So one of the things that I like to think about when I'm looking at the moat of a business is the Buffett check, which basically says, if I handed a disruptor an unlimited checkbook and 5 years, 10 years, could they replicate and displace the business? And I think it's just so fundamentally no. Nintendo spent 4 decades building this IP, and no matter how much money you spend, you can't recreate the generational childhood love and nostalgia that the customers have for Mario and Pokemon, etc. And I think a really great example of this is actually the recent 2023 acquisition of Activision Blizzard from Microsoft, right? They spent almost $70 billion to acquire essentially the IP and the studios of that business, which includes Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, Candy Crush. These are pretty strong brands, but at the same time, are they anywhere near what Nintendo has? I don't think so. I don't even think they're close. One way I'm sort of thinking about it is, if they made a World of Warcraft movie, would it do $1 billion like the Mario movie did? I don't really think so. I definitely don't think a sequel of it would also do $1 billion and be as successful. I just don't think, I don't know, IP it's intangible. It's hard to put a finger on, but I just feel that it is a lot weaker than Mario and Pokemon. And I think ultimately that feeling comes from the fact that Nintendo's IP is so intergenerational and multi-generational. Every time they release a new console and kids get excited and want to play on that console, they release games with those characters from the past and a new generation becomes excited about it. And this is really what Nintendo talks about in their investor material. They're trying to create these unique and family-friendly entertainment that spans multiple generations and creating touch points for each of those generations. And again, the other way I look at it is like, if a kid goes to their dad and says, I want to get the Switch 2 because they're making an Ocarina of Time remake, can you buy it for me? Like, if that dad played the Ocarina of Time on the N64 or on the GameCube and has childhood memories of that, how are they going to say no? I certainly wouldn't be able to say no. I'd be like, let's go today and go buy that thing. So I think that is just like a strength of Nintendo's business that basically no other business can match. Now, what I would say is that having a business like this leads to a key man risk. A surprising amount of the IP that Nintendo has was created by one person, Miyamoto, and he's in his 70s now. And, there's a legitimate concern that he's not going to be here forever. So what is going to happen to the quality of the games and the IP when he's gone? But I think what I've found in researching Nintendo is that they have done a really good job of handoffs and creating a culture that really values the quality and the creativity that they're known for and that they stand for when they release a game. Miyamoto is in his 70s, but they actually transitioned him off Legend of Zelda to Aonuma. I'm gonna pronounce all this stuff wrong. Like 2 decades ago. And Legend of Zelda just kept ticking along with amazing Metacritic scores. These are the scores of some of the key Legend of Zelda games that have been released since that trade-off happened. And 95, 96, Twilight Princess, which I played a lot of, 95, Breath of the Wild, which is insane, such a good game, 97, and then I haven't played Tears of the Kingdom, but 96. And from the comments that I read on the internet, people were really blown away by how they were able to make Breath of the Wild even better. So I think this is a core series in the franchise, and there really hasn't been any decay in the quality of the games. And this is 2 decades of data. So I think that there's a genuinely strong track record here to base that fact on and that opinion on, that they don't have this key man risk. Of course, when he does finally move on from the company permanently, who knows what they'll do, but they do just seem to have built a really strong culture of valuing the quality of what they produce and not letting that slip. So the last thing that I want to touch on when it comes to the intangible assets is how Nintendo handles it from a legal perspective. In a digital world where you don't defend your IP, the quality of the business can erode pretty significantly. I think especially in a world of AI, having unsanctioned reproductions of your work can risk fatiguing your audience, creating content that people think is official but isn't, and maybe detracts from the quality of the brand, or worse, creates a scandal. An example of this is the large culture of Pokemon ROM hacks out there, which are essentially taking the assets of the older games and recreating your own games with those assets. As a consumer of Nintendo, that sounds awesome, but as an investor of Nintendo, it would worry me a little bit, just the association with something that you don't have control over and who knows how it's used. These are games that you can play on your phone and on your computer, and they're free. So I think there's a risk that a customer says, oh, I really feel like playing Pokemon, but I'm not gonna buy a Switch just to play Pokemon, so I'll go and play these ROM hacks. And again, from like a fan perspective, it's great, but from a business perspective, that's probably not what you want. Now, what you see when you do just like even scratching the surface of the research on this, Nintendo is incredibly proactive about protecting their IP, potentially even too much. There's actually like quite a lot of conflict between the fan community and Nintendo in how loose they are with issuing cease and desist letters and legal threats to anybody that uses the IP. And this does upset some of the fans who say that this is a homage to the art and their appreciation for the IP, but it's probably not good business practice to let that just proliferate without any threat. So from an investor point of view, I feel reassured again that this is a sign Nintendo understands the importance of the IP to their business over the long term and takes the steps they need to keep that in place. Okay, so let's talk about the cost advantages. This is where we start to see the effect and the strength of the IP show up in the numbers. And again, this isn't really like a true feature of a moat where they have these inherent cost advantages. It is based on the IP. That is the moat. But I think it's worth looking at and talking about because it demonstrates how important the IP is to the business. So first of all, when it comes to marketing, the IP is the marketing, and this shows up so clearly in the numbers, you cannot deny it. Now, I went ahead and I pulled the advertising to revenue percentage from the income statements of each of these companies over the last couple of years. And what you see is Nintendo's advertising expense is consistently around 6% of their revenues, whereas other businesses with strong franchises like EA, which has EAFC, which was formerly FIFA, and Take-Two, which has Rockstar Gaming, obviously, and is the developer of GTA and Red Dead Redemption and whatnot, but also has a library of mobile games, which the mobile industry is very much a pay to acquire a user industry and requires a lot of marketing spend. Back when I used to be an auditor, I actually audited some mobile gaming companies. And what you see on the income statement is like all this revenue, no costs, advertising costs, and then no more costs. And like that's your margin. So it's not surprising to see this stark difference. And maybe it shows up a little bit better when you look at it this way, but this was Nintendo in FY26 when they launched the Switch, and then in FY23, which is really in the middle of the Switch 1 cycle, even actually towards the end of the Switch 1 cycle. And it's just flat. It's just super stable. They have the same advertising to revenue spend regardless of the year of the cycle that you're in. Whereas EA and Take-Two have to spend more per dollar of revenue in order to drive their business. That is a material advantage for Nintendo. Now, the other place this shows up is the R&D. In one of the previous videos, I compared Nintendo to Apple as a business, and I'm gonna keep probably making that comparison throughout this series because the more I learn about Nintendo, the more it reminds me of Apple as a business. Their R&D as a percentage of revenue is a lot closer to Apple than it is to EA. And you'll see EA as this gray bar over the last, 9 years or so, and then Apple and Nintendo way down here, which again, I think just shows how Nintendo acts a lot more like a cost-conscious hardware business with gaming margins than a pure software gaming company. And then finally, what you also see when you look at the income statement and you compare it to some other competitors is the amount of revenue that Nintendo generates per employee than the rest of the industry. And this is really important, and I'm about to talk about it a lot more, but this industry is facing serious cost pressures. Almost everybody for the last few years has been expanding in terms of employees, and that is what is ballooning the cost of games across the board. Nintendo, even when you compare it to Japanese gaming companies, which I've done here in Square Enix and Capcom, is pretty consistently at least 2 to 4 times more efficient per employee in generating dollars than its competition. So let's switch gears a little bit here and talk about the industry as a whole and why Nintendo has such an advantage here and why the strategic choice of Nintendo to make a less powerful console is such an interesting strategy choice and how it has paid off for the business. What we have currently seen in the last 5 to 10 years is an arms race in the industry predicated on the increasing power of consoles and PCs. These are devices that can render pretty miraculous games, and that puts pressure on game developers to make games that take advantage of that hardware. When I was in high school and more of a gamer than I am now, Skyrim was released. And in researching this, I was looking at some of the screenshots that people post from the game, and these were the graphics of Skyrim when they were released, which was a super AAA game. It's like not that good in hindsight, but it blew my mind at the time. And then now what you'll see, and I'm using Grand Theft Auto 6 as an example because it's probably the biggest AAA game that's going to be released this year, but the graphics on these games are just insane now. Like the detail of even these little leafs down here. And if you're interested in this stuff in more detail, I really recommend Jason Schreier on YouTube. He is a reporter for the Bloomberg News, and I've used him as a source for a lot of this research. But one of the things he sort of talks about in terms of why the costs of developing a game have increased so much in recent years is that a bush is no longer, an abstraction of a bush. It is a bush, and you need to create every single leaf on that bush and then also determine how the physics work for it to blow in the wind. And you need people to do all that. And when you extrapolate that to the size of games now, which are the size of entire continents, it takes a long time and a lot of people to make that work. And that costs a lot of money, which is why we see GTA 6 to have an estimated budget of over $1 billion. Some estimates are saying 2 billion. I don't know. Either way, it's pretty hard to make a return on that. And that's why you're seeing the studios that aren't the owners of the absolute biggest, most AAA game studios shutting down. Apparently, between 2022 and 2025, an estimated 45,000 jobs were lost in the industry. Like, this is really a period of reckoning in the gaming industry. And even at the time of filming this, Microsoft has just announced more layoffs across sales and Xbox. So these are pretty bad times for the industry. Only the biggest and most efficient are going to survive what is happening in the industry right now. Now, what I would say is that I think this is actually a major advantage for Nintendo. And that is for two reasons. The first reason is that I think this looks like a very classic case of the capital cycle that is discussed in the book Capital Returns, where you have this period of capital flooding into the industry because returns look great. And this is what happened in 2021. Because of the pandemic, there was increased demand, interest rates were near zero, so the capital was cheap, and you have this overinvestment ultimately by the players in the industry and new entrants entering the market. Then what happened after the pandemic is that demand normalizes. People aren't going to be trapped at home forever, despite what a lot of people thought. Interest rates normalize, and ultimately there is a glut of oversupply in the industry, which means that there is essentially too much competition in that industry for anyone to make a profit. And that means that people lose money and are over-investing in their businesses. And then that lack of return leads to capital exiting the industry and people pulling back. And that's what you see with all these layoffs and the closure of studios. And I think basically where we are is at this beginning of the upswing. Nintendo never actually entered that race. That's exactly what we saw when we were looking at the revenue per employee and the revenue per dollar of R&D. Nintendo just refused to play that game. They stuck to what they were good at. So not only were they not really hurt by this capital cycle, but they're also in an incredible position coming out of it that they can hopefully capitalize on. Now, the second point is the argument that I'm going to make in terms of the actual moat that Nintendo has here, not based on the IP. And one of the ways you can sort of decipher whether or not an advantage a business has is actually part of the moat is whether or not it's a management choice. Now, Nintendo has never chosen to enter the arms race for graphical fidelity and these massive games that really take advantage of all the hardware capabilities that we have. That is a management choice. What I'm arguing the moat is that because they have never done that, or at least haven't done that for multiple consoles over decades, the customer base doesn't expect cutting edge graphics and massive games. They expect what Nintendo does best, which is create good games with good enough graphics and performance. Call of Duty or GTA or Assassin's Creed or any of these major AAA games, they can't release a game where they go backwards in graphical fidelity or really in performance at all. That's why I call this an arms race. They have to keep being at the cutting edge of what is possible because that's what the customer expects. Nintendo's customers just want good games with good enough graphics, and in the tech industry, even being a year or two behind on technology is meaningfully cheaper than it is to be at the cutting edge. Just think of what it means as a consumer if you want to buy a MacBook from 1 or 2 years ago versus buying the latest released MacBook. And because Nintendo's customers don't mind that the games are not the most performant games possible, I believe that is the element of a true moat for Nintendo. Okay, so now let's talk about network effects and switching costs, which is really the leg of Nintendo's moat that I would say is the weakest by far. Nintendo obviously doesn't have network effects in the same way a social media company might. That said, its eShop business line does have characteristics of an early network effect. What would happen if this was successful is that they would have this large install base of Switch 2 users. Their eShop would therefore attract more third-party developers who would create more games, which creates a better value proposition for the Nintendo Switch, and then more people would buy the Switch, and that cycle would repeat. Now, this was essentially non-existent prior to the Switch 1, but Nintendo made the smart decision that all Switch 1 games will be forward compatible with the Switch 2. And what that means is that the Switch 2 is starting from a materially stronger starting place in its life than the Switch 1 was, as a base that that platform can build off of. You can play Cyberpunk, Deltarune, Elden Ring, Hades, Assassin's Creed, all these games that have been released on the eShop today on day one of the Switch. And that wasn't the case before, and it could become an important part of Nintendo's business. But I think what's important to recognize is that Nintendo's advantage with the hardware also sort of caps how far this can go. So the Switch 2 is meaningfully more powerful than the Switch 1. That's why it can play these games at a pretty good level, I think, for the casual gamer. I was watching this video while I was doing the research, and I don't really consider myself a gamer, but I can't really tell the difference between these. Well, I can tell the difference, but I don't really care. They're all look pretty fine to me. That said, I don't think the Switch 2 is going to play GTA 6 very well. I don't think it will play the next Elder Scrolls game very well. That being underpowered choice is part of Nintendo's strategy, but I think holds it back from ever being able to truly have a marketplace like Steam might have, or even PlayStation's eShop or Xbox's eShop / Game Pass. The other problem with Nintendo's lack of network effects is that there's no social graph that creates these switching costs. If you're into competitive or social gaming, all the most popular games like Fortnite or Call of Duty or League of Legends, they are all on other platforms. And I'm honestly not sure if these games are available on the Switch, but I don't think anyone would meaningfully play competitively on a Switch. So if that's what you're into, it sort of creates a good reason to leave the Nintendo ecosystem, which is a bit of a problem, I would say. And that brings me to what I'm calling the Nintendo gamer life cycle. And this is sort of how I imagine the ideal customer journey of Nintendo. And we'll come back to this later on as well when we talk about the risks and opportunities. But really you sort of have your first gaming experiences on the Switch because an older sibling or a friend introduces you to it. And then in your childhood, in those years 9 to 12, you're probably pretty into those games. And this is probably where you spend like most of your time as a Nintendo gamer. And then I think when you get older and you become a teenager, your priorities shift and probably you don't care at all about Nintendo's games. You just want to play with your friends online and be more in that competitive environment. And this is when you leave the Nintendo ecosystem. The important part, I think, of Nintendo's gamer life cycle is that you return as an adult. You're busier, you have less time to game, and Nintendo has simpler games, and maybe you have kids and then you want to introduce it to them. So this is sort of how I imagine the Nintendo gamer life cycle, the important part being the loop, and that the loop stays intact for the next generation of gamers to come through that life cycle again. So the reason why I bring it up is that I think there is this sort of natural exit part for Nintendo gamers, but I don't think of it as a fatal issue. Nintendo doesn't even really compete for this. They compete for here and here. So it's sort of just part of the business model that I think you have to understand as an investor, but it does also show up as an opportunity for them that we'll talk about in the next video. Okay, so finally I want to talk about pricing power, because this is where it sort of all comes together and where the strength of the IP is most clearly demonstrated. Pricing power is the hallmark of a great business. Now, the first thing I want to make clear before we have this discussion in detail is that games do not have a long shelf life. According to this analysis, most games are discounted 30 to 50% after just 6 months, which is pretty brutal if you think about it. Now what I want to show you is the price chart for Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and this is the Switch 1 version. I don't know why this shows up on the chart. This is bad charting, but it was released in 2023, and you can see that it had essentially no discounting whatsoever until like now, a year after the Switch 2 was released. And if you go to the Switch 2 chart, you basically just see a continuation of the trend. There was no discounting for the last year since the Switch 2 was released. And then there was one discount down $20 in July. And then it's right back up to full price. Now, the absolute best comp I can think of for Tears of the Kingdom is the God of War franchise. This is a Sony first-party exclusive title that has been around since 2005. It is extremely widely known. It has a strong fan base. It has over 200,000 ratings on the PlayStation Store and an average rating of 4.8 out of 5. So this is really as close as it gets for Sony as a home run can get. And yet, despite all of that, what you see when you look at the price charts is a very different story to Tears of the Kingdom. This is a game that was also released in 2023, and we can see that it had its first major discount within 5 to 6 months of being released. And then within basically a year, it was permanently marked down 50%. And it's essentially just stayed that way and crept downwards since. This is not Sony messing up execution. This is the industry norm for everybody, for every major player, except Nintendo. And that is ultimately why Nintendo has such a large moat and why understanding that moat is so important. When you look at that pricing chart, the games that Nintendo spends its money to produce have literal years of sales at full profits versus everybody else who has to start reducing their margins on those games within just a few months. That is a material advantage that Nintendo has and should continue to stay that way as long as Nintendo protects its IP and keeps doing what it's doing. Now, that does not mean that it's invincible, and there are some very real threats that are happening right now that we need to think about when we think about Nintendo as an investor. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about in the next video. We're going to look at the risks and we're going to look at the opportunities. So if you want to see that or you found this video useful, please subscribe. I'm trying to get to 100 subscribers and you can really help me with that. So thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.